In the process of photosynthesis, we know that we are going to require a photon of light, we're going to require water, and we're going to need carbon dioxide. All of those things are necessary to do something called carbon fixation. And that process of carbon fixation turns CO2, which is in the gaseous form, into a solid structure. Specifically, that is going to be a carbohydrate, which I mentioned in class briefly, called G3P, which stands for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, but don't worry about memorizing that name there. So moving on, we have our light-dependent reactions, which are sometimes also just called the light reactions. And what's happening there is, as we mentioned, we are going to need photons from the sun, and we're going to need water to create two different products. Those are my water droplets that you have there next to the H2O. And the two things we're able to create are ATP and something called NADPH. So again, obviously this equation doesn't really make sense because a photon of light plus H2O isn't able to create those things. But through the process that we have in the light-dependent reactions, we're able to make them. So we're going to talk about how that's happening in more detail in a second. But keep in mind that when we are talking about this NADPH, what's happening is we're taking NADP plus and converting it by having it gain a hydrogen and an electron to turn it into NADPH. So now let's zoom in on plant cells. Here we have some plant cells. You can see they're pretty rectangular in their shape because, of course, they have their cell wall. And then within each of those plant cells, we are going to have chloroplasts. Remember, that's what Wes presented on for his presentation back last semester. And within each of those plant cells, you can have 10 to 50 per cell. So let's look at, if we zoom in on one of those chloroplasts, what that actually looks like. So the outside of the chloroplast is going to have a membrane. Then the area that's between the membrane, so all of this area here, all of this, you can kind of think of it like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. It's the fluid inside of it. That's called the stroma. Within the stroma of the chloroplast, we are going to have something that sort of looks like little stacks of pancakes, and each individual pancake is going to be something called the thylakoid. But if you add up all of those pancakes and look at it as a stack, that will then be called something called a granum. We also, surprisingly, are going to find mitochondria in our chloroplasts. So this may seem weird because we're inside of an organelle, but we do in fact find those mitochondria in the little powerhouses of cells within those chloroplasts. In addition, we are going to find ribosomes there. So now we have some other grana is the plural of granum, shown, and we can find more ribosomes sort of either in the stroma or attached to the thylakoid or the grana. So those are the main structures you need to know of the chloroplast, but we need to look specifically at the thylakoid now. So again, our thylakoids are each of those individual pancake stacks. Let me zoom in for you now. Now there's not a whole lot to the thylakoid right now, but keep in mind that it is made up of a membrane, and that membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. And then inside, in here, in the space between the membrane, we are going to have something called the lumen. It may sometimes also be referred to as the thylakoid space. We're going to continue zooming in now, and let's look specifically at that phospholipid bilayer. You'll recall from last term that phospholipid bilayers are going to have several things embedded in them. So it's not just going to be those phospholipids. It will additionally perhaps have proteins. So let me show you what that structure will look like. So to begin with, just to orient yourself, keep in mind that outside here we're in the stroma, because if you look out here, the stroma is the area that are outside of those thylakoids in the actual membranes. So if we are outside, we're in the stroma, and if we're inside, we're going to be in the lumen, so the inside of those thylakoids. We also have our phospholipids that we know are making up our bilayer. So what we're seeing here is this is the location of where photosynthesis is going to happen. So one of the first things we need is for the light reactions to occur, or the light-dependent reactions, is going to be a photon of light from the sun. That photon of light is going to then first encounter something called photosystem 2. So we can see it hitting it there. We also are going to have water present, and it'll be found in the lumen. The water is going to release H pluses, and with it, it will then leave behind O2, which we know will leave. That's one of the outputs here in the process of photosynthesis. So again, just to reiterate, we have a photon of light hits photosystem 2. That's necessary. We also know that water is involved in this process. Water will lose its hydrogens. We need a buildup of hydrogens in the lumen, and that's necessary to fuel the production of ATP. And then, of course, when we take those hydrogens off, we're left with oxygen gas, and that will be something that leaves in this entire equation. I'll go into more detail about why we want this high concentration of H pluses in the lumen to make ATP in just a little bit, but I'm just going to go over our basic steps now. We also are going to have I'm just going to draw it in purple here, another protein, and this is going to be necessary to help us pull these H pluses down into the lumen so we can once again build up that concentration inside. We're going to also have a photon that is going to excite our other photosystem, photosystem 1. And then the last thing that we need to draw here in the phospholipid bilayer is something called ATP synthase. And it'll use the high concentration of H pluses, the hydrogens that we have in the lumen, because they'll want to go down their concentration gradient. Once we have that concentration built up, we can have them move through the ATP synthase to get back to the stroma. And the movement of those H pluses through ATP synthase causes ATP synthase to sort of turn like a wheel. And through that, it will actually cause ADP and a phosphate to come together and make ATP. So you can see that I've sort of drawn that in here with our little wheel present. And so once again, it's that energy that's turning the wheel, creating our ATP. The other thing we need to add in, as we know, in our light reactions or our light-dependent reactions, we're creating something called NADPH. So it's a little hard to show in our phospholipid bilayer, so let me just sort of draw it in. So I don't want you to worry too much here about what's going on with our NADP plus and our NADPH. So I'll go into more detail about this in class on Friday. But NADPH is something that's NADP plus is something called a final electron acceptor. So it's going to take an electron and use it to make NADPH. So again, don't worry about that specific step too much, but also keep in mind that we are going to be using our water in this process, shown here, because it's donating all of these H pluses and also electrons to replace electrons that are getting excited by photons. And so that water is getting stripped of its hydrogens and its electrons, and we're going to be left with our oxygen that we have. So I realize that is pretty complicated, and there are sort of 6 steps that we went through here. Don't worry about all the specific details. I'm going to go into much more detail about that in class on tomorrow on Friday, but I just wanted to give you guys a heads up so you can sort of see what this phospholipid bilayer looks like, and we'll talk about specifically all of these different steps that we have with our photosystems and our ATP synthase and how we're able to create our NADPH. All of that we'll go into more detail about again when I see you in class on Friday. So that's all that I have to tell you guys right now. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry that it was slightly complex, but again, we'll go into more detail about the specifics of what's happening, particularly here when I see you in class on Friday, but I wanted to give you some background knowledge so that you knew exactly where this is happening. Just to review, obviously we're starting in a plant cell. In those plant cells, each of these little green dots are chloroplasts. We want to zoom in on those chloroplasts, which we now see here. The chloroplasts themselves have little stacks of pancakes, and each of those pancakes is something called a thylakoid. Those thylakoids, if we zoom in on one of them, We will have a membrane around the outside, which is a phospholipid bilayer. Inside of that, we'll have a space that's called the lumen. Now, if we want to zoom in specifically on that phospholipid bilayer, we can look over here and we can see, obviously, this is going to be that bilayer. It's made up of those phospholipids. We start off with sunlight. An electron will excite this photosystem. In addition, we are going to have H pluses being pulled into the lumen. We're going to need those. We want to build up a concentration there. We are also going to have an electron that excites our photosystem 1. And then when we have a concentration of H pluses built up in the lumen, we will then use those to move down their concentration gradient and move through this red structure called ATP synthase. And so the sort of flowing kind of like a river, right? If you were to have a wheel in that, it would create energy. And so the movement of those H pluses through the ATP synthase will turn a wheel and help ADP and phosphate combine and will make us create this ATP. In addition, one of the other steps we do in the light-dependent reactions or the light reactions is we need to create NADPH, and we do that through NADP+. So tomorrow, again, we'll go into more detail about how that NADP+ is able to turn into NADPH, which we can then send with the ATP to the light-independent reactions. And just to give you this bigger picture view, right, in this screencast, we're just talking about our light-dependent reactions, right? And so each of these pancakes are the thylakoid. We need our sunlight and our water, and our end products that we're creating are the ATP through the ATP synthase. We also are creating our NADPH, which again, more detail about that on Friday. And we're creating oxygen as a product that will leave the actual plant because of the breakdown of water.